So good morning. I am honored to be here, and I'm going to bring up the rest of the panel, two of which you've met already, Orlin Bishop and Sarah King, who did a beautiful job this morning, and Caverly Morgan, who is joining us as well, who is a part of the SAND family, correct, in some ways? Great, thank you. Wow, that light is very bright over there. So good morning, welcome everyone. I am hoping that we can kind of squeeze in and get close together, maybe move up a little bit if there's space between you and the stage. And this is my first time here. I don't know how it goes. I didn't even know the two people who started this last night. I said, so whose conference is this? And so it's a pleasure to meet you, and thank you for introducing yourself to me just moments ago. And so I'm new, I have not been here, and I'm not sure if we're following the protocol, the usual protocol. And so we're just not. And so this is going to be a very interactive time together. We're going to co-create this space. We're going to co-create the conversation that we're having. It's not like we here on the stage are some, experts that's going to tell you things around this subject. We're really going to explore together. Is that okay? Y'all up for it? Great. So we want to really begin by making it a little bit warm and fuzzy. This subject is not necessarily very warm and fuzzy for most people. And so it would be wonderful if you would, we're going to do a little beginning dyad work where somebody that you don't know, okay, and we're going to pop a question to you. So find somebody that you actually don't know and get into a dyad. Is there anybody that doesn't have a partner? Raise your hand. If you don't have a partner, fine. There's a person here that does not have a partner. There's another one. There you are. Y'all connect. Anybody else that doesn't have a partner? No partner over here. There's one right coming up the hall, down the aisle for you. Great. So say hello. And we're going to go back a little bit in your life and think about what was home for you. It could be your actual home, if it was well attended, or what makes you feel at home. And we want you to just kind of think about, each of you think about, what was that sense of where you felt like you really belonged? There was home, who was there? What did it look like? Where was it? What were the smells, the sights, the tastes? What was your comfort food? Who cooked that comfort food? What brought you into, as a child, what really made you feel that sense of belonging? And if it wasn't as a child, move it forward until you find whatever that place is that you can relate to this question of feeling, yeah, this feels really good, and I feel here and present. And this food and this smell and this place made me feel like, when you think about it, it feels really, really, really nice and pleasant. So find that, and figure out who goes first. Let's go back to the hands, maybe the ones with the longest fingers. I love hands. I have a hand fetish, by the way. That was awesome. And whoever goes first, you have 3 minutes each. You're going to have 3 minutes to actually bring an awareness of that time and place and who was there, what was the food, what was the smells, what was the neighborhood like, just dive into that for a moment, yeah? So we're back. Popcorn, why are you here? Any answers to that last question? Here in the front. Please use the mic.
The word fun came up, and I think for me, as someone who have become more and more engaged in this conversation between the contemplative and the social justice, along with the discomfort that can arise, the fun, because there's so much innovation and learning. I feel like it's where the real juice is in my practice. So yeah.
Thank you. Fun. I didn't expect that.
Well, I'm here because I don't want to be here. I'm tired of dealing with it. I'm tired of the race, the thing. And that's why I have to be here, because I don't want to hide from it. And I want to figure out how I can help.
Thank you. Yeah.
I'm here because I've appreciated so much the way the conversation is around looking at our internal narrative about the oneness. And I'm really curious about whether we'll get to the point of being able to talk about the narrative of power and richness and the fact that one of the great contributions of the Occupy movement was that we were introduced to the idea of the 1% owning so much of our power, the power and influence of money and legislative and policies. And so looking to see how do we bring that into play as we're talking about what we do as individuals within this context of the accumulation of power threatening social justice almost every direction we turn.
Thank you. Beautiful.
Is this working? Okay. I guess it was thrown in my face when I did a fact-finding mission in Israel-Palestine, and witnessing a lot of heinous things there, I came home pretty traumatized. And at one point, I recognized not being anti or pro any side, and having a sense of holding a middle line, understanding the trauma on both sides. And yet I was traumatized by the process, and it did a number on me. And so I'm wanting to be able to hold an asana, a position of strength, and one that can make a difference without me drowning in the process.
Right in front of me there.
Hello. I'm here. I didn't know this was going to be part of the conference. And in the work that I do as a therapist and organizational psychologist with social services in San Francisco, this is the conversation that we are trying to navigate, and my role is to hold that space. So I'm so curious about how is the conversation happening beyond what we are doing? What are the ways that you hold space for such a delicate conversation? And as a woman of color, how do I show up in that conversation when my trauma comes up? So I'm also holding the space and those pieces come up. So just so curious about how are we navigating this conversation in a way that honors both sides and everyone who shows up as souls in that moment in a non-dual way. Like, I'm just so eager to learn about it. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Great.
Where Conda help me out?
Yeah, either let's get.
Yep.
Hi, thank you. I'm here just to hear your stories, to hear the story of what's happening. I'm from Canada. And it's not just one or two, it's all communities. How do we bring everybody into community, including, and Sarah, as you mentioned, the earth? We're in Canada, we're trying to go through our reconciliation with our First Nations, and through the residential schools, through this and through that. And as the Shognosh, white man in Anishinaabe, I know my role, but my voice has always been heard most. So I want my voice not to be heard, but I want everybody's voices to be heard. And I want you guys to talk about that, how your voices need to be heard in the conversation. Miigwech.
Beautiful, thank you. The woman back here with the red scarf, yeah, in the way, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much for hosting this conversation. I am here because I see the ways that the conditioned mind, my conditioned mind, puts the spiritual over here and the political over there, as if these were two separate endeavors. And I know that that's a dangerous compartmentalization potentially, and I really want to dissolve that divide completely, to understand that, to really clearly see and be living the fact that the end of oppression is the end of personal suffering, that these are not two separate things but one.
Beautiful, thank you. There's a couple of over there. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
Did we miss somebody? I can go next.
I'm sorry?
Did we miss somebody? Because I could go next.
No, go ahead, go ahead.
Okay.
You have the mic.
Hi, Kanda. I was at the POC retreat with you in July.
Oh, wonderful.
So
At Spirit Rock.
at Spirit Rock. So I originally chose this both for the topic, but because I know most of those who are on the panel, and I was also deeply, deeply moved by the two in the center who spoke today at a soul level. And I think if I speak from a soul level, which feels vulnerable, even having this mic, it's not for me, it's for all, and the reasons are love, because I love this existence and all that I see, and pain, because there's so much surplus suffering in the world, and it doesn't need to be this way. And I want us, I know we all feel it. And as I've been sitting deeply in my practices and re-indigenizing myself in my practices, thinking about the generations, at least 7 generations before and then after, where we sit in the chain. So love, pain, and this chain. Because if we can, I feel like you all maybe have answers or can help us guide ourselves to collective answers about where we sit in this chain and how we can turn this tide. So those are my reasons, but I don't think they're just my reasons. I think there are lots of reasons that lots of us are coming here together, and I'm just one voice and one locus of consciousness bringing this forth for more than myself. And I thank you all.
Thank you. Yeah.
Hello. I have a question about oneness. So I am...
Can you put the mic up closer?
Oh, is this better?
Yeah, thank you.
Very good. So it's hard for me to understand the concept of oneness when there's so much division in the world. And in my personal life, it's easy to see the division and it's easy to feel the division because it is thrown at me on micro and macro levels all day, every day. So to understand the concept of oneness and how I can be one with all when I'm just one, usually in many, even in this very room. You know what I mean? Yeah. So I don't know how to, so I'll engage in dialogue with people, and it starts out as a happy dialogue. It is my disposition in life. I'm always smiling. But then the conversation becomes heavy in social justice, and it's hard to keep the anger from like spilling over. Mm-hmm. Because how can we be one when there's so much oppression? Mm-hmm. So I figured this would be a good place to be to at least maybe learn something that can help me understand how I can be one and not feel like one.
That's so wonderful. I love what you're saying. We're gonna have a little bit of conversation here, if you don't mind. So this conference on non-duality, right? This oneness conversation. Why are you here? What made you come to this conference when you don't understand the oneness and this? Because I resonate with exactly what you're saying, right? And as a woman of color, as a black woman in America, it is absolutely like, you know, there's this kind of ability to have the privilege to think of oneness for certain people and not so much for others. And so I'm curious why, because that's what this whole conference is about, what would bring you here to talk about oneness when it's such a hard space to reconcile?
I will be very honest. The reason I'm here is because of my friend over there.
Okay. All right.
Who I speak with about social justice issues all the time, and she, you know, she's Brazilian. I am originally from Senegal. We have to deal with a lot, and she has found a way to deal with it in a way that is more healthy. And she deals with it, and she learns from conferences like this.
I see.
So she has held my hand to be here so that I can have the same amount of, maybe not peace, but be able to have a healthy conversation. And I mean, I can have an intellectual conversation, but then it ends up looking or feeling angry, while she can have the exact same conversation, and it doesn't.
And get through it.
Get through it. So if she can get through it, because she deals with a lot of the same things that I deal with, why can't I get through it? So she's walked me in here, and I've come here openly. I want to learn, but again, I just don't know how to escape. It's just, you live it, you know? Yeah. It's different than to see it.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that. Let's get the one gentleman right way back here in the back with the beautiful beard.
So there's a number of reasons why I'm interested in this topic, but most recently I saw this interview with Pat McCabe. I don't know if people know her. She's a...
Yeah, I know Pat. She's a friend of mine.
Okay, and she mentioned we often get stuck in this paradigm of power over, where people with social power have power over, you know, become oppressors, and that in fact both people suffer, right? If you're oppressing somebody, there's something wrong with you, right? And we're also born into a culture where these paradigms exist. And so her idea was to move into like a hoop, right? Hoop of oneness, where we're all just, you know, I think what we're all trying to get to at some point. And so what I see people do in the social justice movement is stay in the old paradigm, or the paradigm of power over, and it becomes a struggle for power, or, you know, including the pain of people, you know, that if people have been oppressed through race or class or gender, whatever, hold on to that, the emotional part, and try to then sort of flip the power structure, but still maintain this whole power versus oppression sort of dynamic. And the question I would have is, curious what people think about trying to move away from that. Is that a good idea, or is it possible, or if so, how?
Great, thank you. All right, I think we will end with that. Thank you for, I'm sorry, we're going to have to keep moving. Thank you for your input. And you see that there's a variety of stuff in the room. around this subject. And so we are, as we said, we come to this panel without much of an agenda, quite frankly. And, you know, we talked about having an agenda, and because you're supposed to have an agenda. And then we thought, well, this is an agendaless agenda that we're going to kind of co-create and see what's in the room. And so there was a couple of things that we talked about, and Orlin, that you mentioned about the commitment, and maybe that would make sense to bring in now.
Thank you so much for sharing the why you came. Now, how to be with what is here is always the deeper reason. How to be somewhere where others will be, and I can't control why they came. But so the why that brings me personally into this time space engages with other people's why. How to be with someone else's why. And so I have to ask myself, am I willing to host your why you came? Because the deeper social responsibility is I am responsible for making your why true. And mutually, if you want to take social responsibility for why I am here, we then could have the deeper conversation. But if I'm here just for myself, we will feel the weight, and the weight will get heavier all the time because I'm not committed to really being here. I can't be here by myself if someone else is here as well. It makes it really uncomfortable. And this is why I really have to ask, am I willing to go to the next step of why I'm here? Which is to ask the question, what will make you being here more real, more meaningful? And can we go there together? So there's a commitment level of whenever I make a choice to go somewhere, chances are you'll meet someone. And who is responsible for that meeting? Who do we blame for being in a place where someone else will be, and we don't know who started it? Who made the first choice to be there? So this is the phenomena in reality. The earth, where we all are, is conspiring for us to belong. The earth is not neutral. It's an intelligence that says everyone needs this experience at a level in which it is not just for ourselves. So it comes back to something fundamental about the reality of, am I really willing to be on earth? I wasn't just born to exist separate from the realities that is part of the nature of being. So we did, the first thing I would say, we were born into a culture, I would say not quite. We were born into the realm of possibilities, far more complex than our culture. It takes a little long time for human beings to agree with the culture that we have now, because even as children, we are resisting it. And someone keeps bribing us to give up our possibilities and accept scarcity and uniformity to those we love. We give up all of our divinity for love of the person who we trust the most, telling us this is the real world. And then when we go outside of the home, we meet other people who have a different, this is the real world. So thank you for following your friend here. Because most people leave their homes to go out with their friends to find the real world. Because there's a question there in friendship. Can we make sense of what our parents told us? Because we love them, but we don't see the world that they see. So as children, we're trying to go to the next step. And who helps the child to come to the resilience of transforming inheritance? You know, this is where the world is. The risk is if the child doesn't get permission to go to the next step, we take on the inheritance. And no one really believes in their inheritance as much as they may want to protect it. The deeper inner experience is it's not enough to keep me in life. Person wants more than inheritance. We want engagement of consciousness with someone coming from a different direction, because cosmic intelligence says there's a conversation to have that is very different than the ones I'm having at home in my inherited worldview. And in human rights work we've done for a long time says the person that's most likely to violate your human rights lives in the house with you. Meaning they will insist that you be like them and lose your freedom to become capable of transforming the culture that awfully oppress their own children. And the rights of the child is probably the most significant rights to explore. Not the rights of adults, the rights of the child. Can we allow them to mature the next step of becoming, even within the culture that we want to support them to grow through and develop in, even with all the goodness that parents want to do, can we trust a kind of devotion to the development of a child to support them to go out into the world and make friendships with people different than the culture that they're born into? If we don't start there, as we get older, the complexity of what we've inherited gets harder to engage with. Because at that level, we're given actually a lot of societal accomplishments and rewards to sustain the system of the culture. And so what we were looking at is like, how committed can we be with the invitation to be here, even at this conference, at this time? Like, what next level of invitation is necessary? We've done all we can to get you here. Now that you're here, what else is needed? Because we could choreograph that, but we need to hear as a community, what would it be for you to say, I am at a level of deep commitment to not go home with the stuff that I brought. Let us unburden it if we can. Because at some point, on the way to where else you have to go, you might run into the same conditions. And why not for now practice healing at a level in which we don't have to go back to the same stuff? The world can change from here. The world in me. And so that is commitment. Am I willing to keep carrying the burden of an old world in my thoughts and feelings and my will, or am I willing to renew my commitments to let the world start again in my perception of it, in my interactions with others who carry their worldviews, and see what happens. It's a ritual that could be true when we commit to it.
Beautiful. Yeah. Sarah?
You know, in this moment, I'd like to do just a little bit of a check-in, because when we first began, Khanda led us into this phenomenal space of home and belonging inside of our bodies, hopefully for many of you. And what I'm sensing is that we've been on the beginnings of a journey together. And so we started out from this place of, what did home feel like for you? And maybe if the home that you were brought up in didn't necessarily feel like home, and for me, this carries really deep resonance because I'm thinking of home as more of a metaphor. So maybe if this country, which is your home, or whatever country that you come from, which is your home, didn't necessarily reflect that embodied experience back to you, then it is quite possible that perhaps for some of you, you've been living a life where you feel estranged from that fundamental right of the feeling of home, the feeling and connection to that sense of belonging when you're inside of the place that you dwell, but also that feeling of safety and belonging when you leave your home and you're walking and you're navigating in the streets. And I was just sensing into what might be arising in our bodies. That's something that I'd really like to check in with for all of us, because as we move from the conversation about home and nurturance and coziness and safety and belonging, I felt really settled in my chair. I felt kind of a sinking in sensation. My shoulders dropped. The muscles around my temples felt soft and around my throat. And then as we began to get into the conversation in terms of what we were all bringing with us into the room, the why we are here, this is only my experience. I began to tap into some real grief. And grief is just a word. So what that felt like for me was tightness around my heart. It was a quivering sensation, like a cage. It made me feel as though I wanted to get up off of this stage and embrace each one of you. I felt a coldness and a heaviness in my legs. A difficulty with reaching into the energetic roots that I know exist between myself and that are linking me with all of you in that root system that I spoke about during my presentation. And there, for me, is something really traumatizing about knowing that beneath all of our exterior facades, I know for a fact that we emanate from the space of the absolute, that we are an arising from the oneness. And yet, in the space of relationship, on a day-to-day basis, that's not necessarily the messaging and the communication that I am getting. Now, sometimes for me, I'll give you a little example of what this may look like for me in terms of my spiritual practice. when I'm walking around in the world and I see faces that look different than mine, I have been psychologically primed by my cultural conditioning to make a lot of assumptions about every single face that I meet. And just because I am a woman of color, I'm a black woman, I'm also a woman of mixed race, there's so many different identifiers I could put out there. But because I consider myself to belong to a class of people who are oppressed, doesn't mean that there aren't mechanisms in my mind and in my heart and in my body which are enforcing that oppression within me. I have to take responsibility for that. So as I am walking and I am navigating, I may see a face, and this happens to me a lot. I'll see a face and I'll think, that's a white person. They're from a European background. They're born here in America. They're of a certain age. Maybe if they don't necessarily smile or look my way and acknowledge my presence as I walk by, the thoughts begin to spiral. And it could go anywhere from, man, are they having a bad day? To, they might be racist. They might not like or appreciate me for who I am because of the way that I look. They have a history of privilege, of protection, and of safety that has been afforded to them because of the way that they look. And then there is an arrow that pierces my heart of anger. And all of a sudden, I have made up this incredibly complex narrative around this total stranger that I pass by on the street. I have no idea what kind of life they are living. And this is where my spirituality, my spiritual practices, my contemplative skills really come to bear. Because in that moment, I'm able to feel into the disconnect in my legs, the tightening in my heart, the narrative in my mind, and then I can open up to a place and space that is more rooted in possibility, that is less defined. And I can remind myself, I have this narrative in my mind about this person that tells me, I know who you are, I know what you're about, I know what you think of me. And then there is also this pain that I am carrying that is so deeply intergenerational. It is the pain of my mother in segregated Virginia South. It's the pain of my grandmother who lived through Jim Crow. It's the pain of every single sharecropping ancestor who I had, those who were enslaved. And then it is also the pain of my Irish ancestors who were not enslaved and who came to this country. And I have this memory. I asked my aunt one day, I said, I did this genetic test, and I said, I just found out that I'm a quarter Irish, and I had no idea, living in my entire life, knowing that so much of the fear and the hatred and the anger that I had carried looking at so many faces who I assumed were white identified, that European blood also ran within me. How do I reconcile this within my body? And she looked at me and she said, oh, honey, there's no way that came through love. It was probably rape. So you don't need to worry about that. Just focus in on your blackness. Now, in that moment, what I was really wanting to consider was the possibility that two people had come together several generations ago in spite of the cultural conditioning of this country, in spite of the institutions that were built to place us in these power structures, power against rather than power with. I wanted to entertain the idea that they were still able to fall in love, and that their love is speaking through my heart, through this body, that it can emanate forth, and that that can transform the ways in which I encounter the people who I see on the street. But that was shut down in that moment. Now, I don't have any idea how these people came together, but I think what it is that I'm trying to offer up to the audience today is that we have these phenomenal histories of complexity that live deep inside of our bodies. That we have these rich histories of love and of pain and of betrayal, so rich, that are playing out in our hearts and in our minds and in the assumptions that we make about one another. And I believe that we really need to dig into our spiritual practices in a way that doesn't push those complexities aside in the name of just oneness, but that we have to really consider how we can build containers and relationships and experiences that can hold that complexity with intimacy and tenderness, that can hold it maybe with some mourning, that can hold the grief, but then also that can hold the joy of all of us coming together. And maybe if we can feel rather than think our way through that process with one another, then we can come to meet each other with a greater sense of realness, not just what's up here. Not all of the cultural conditioning, which is going to remain, but I'm just wondering, what would it take in this place, to play off of what you were saying, Orlin, what would it truly take for us to feel into belonging here, now, in a way that we could take that with us out into the world? Because I'm not making the assumption that all of you came here to SAND and automatically felt the experience of belonging. And maybe that's something that we can explore. Would you all be willing to just turn to someone right now? Let's do another dyadic exploration. And let's just have a conversation. Let's just get really real with one another and discuss. Do you feel as though you belong here at SAND? And if you don't necessarily feel that belonging, what would it take for you to feel that in this space? Just for a few minutes.
I've always questioned the word home. That's a very powerful word. And I could say, yes, I felt very safe at home. And then decades later, I found out, whoa, things happened. I'm not safe. I felt safer traveling outside the country. When I started flying back to America, to my home, I was in tears. I didn't want to come. And as I got closer to my home in Pennsylvania, it's like, no. But what I really want to share, so I'm getting back into feeling oneness with my home, physical home, home with my country, home with the planet, home with the divine. And yet, one thing I want to share is there's one race, the human race, with 7 billion different shades of brown. The white supremacists are brown because they're of European background. And it's the American Indians who, when they saw these beings come over, these blonde-haired, blue-eyed people on ships, they assumed they were gods, and they didn't know Europe existed. We were on a flat turtle planet, a flat turtle continent. So it was the American Indian who said, "Ah, pale face, white man," and that stuck. And the Europeans have ever since said, "We'll talk to the great white chief in Philadelphia, in Baltimore, wherever." So that whole word white, I'm not as white as whites of my pupils. You're not black like the black of your pupils. We are all, melanin is the only skin tone. Every human being is brown, darker brown, lighter brown, depending on the summer, depending on the winter. And so we got to drop this black. You're not black. You're of African Euro descent, like President Obama.
Let's pause there for a moment. I think it's really, I think one of the things that I heard when we started this conversation is that what drew so many of us into the room is the recognition that if you are drawn to this conference, you on some level recognize, yes, we are one. And yet the reason we're in this conversation is when you look around and you see what's arising in the world, how many of you would say that what you see arising in the world are actions that are on behalf of or in service to that recognition of oneness?
Not much.
So it's what draws me to this conversation is how important it is for us, and in this moment I'm actually just going to speak to the white identified people in the room.
But we're not white. Please start calling us European, by the continent.
I hear you.
My Ukrainian is not white.
Yeah, I hear you.
Please don't say white or black anymore. Please, we've got to transcend that to our continent roots.
Yeah.
Do you understand? If you don't, you're in old paradigm thinking. The new paradigm is we're all one with brown shades. The white supremacists come from a European background. They get tan in the summer. They're brown. They're brown.
If I may, something that interests me about whiteness, and when I'm talking about whiteness, when I'm speaking about whiteness, if I may. You may not. Okay. It's not a problem if you don't wish to receive what I have to offer. It's not a problem. But I feel that others do. And what I would like to point to is that, for example, when I'm talking about whiteness, I'm talking about not just white skin. I'm talking about protocols and practices that support a lens of white supremacy, which is not in keeping with our deepest understanding of oneness. If you're sitting in this room, you likely have some recognition of your shared being, but it should be, and again, I'm speaking to white identified people in this moment, it should be, I think, very interesting to us how little we are encouraged to examine our relationship with power dynamic. And that's not just about color, it's about dynamic, it's about process, it's about the recognition that in a white supremacist, through a white supremacist lens, it's a lens of domination. So that lens of domination is one that we as white identified people, we don't take responsibility for. We forget that we're even white. We resist the idea of saying, yes, I'm part of this, because we can societally. Folks with me on that? So this conversation about what is mine to reconcile has become very, very interesting to me. Consider for a moment, just for a moment, if you were standing in a crowd and there were black bodies that were chained, how disassociated from your shared humanity? How disconnected from your shared humanity would you have to be for that to be okay? Someone lifting up a black child and weighing it and poking it and prodding it for sale. How disconnected from your own humanity would you have to be for that to be all right? And so something that I'm passionate about is how can we recognize that it's our humanity? We cannot participate in a process of othering without suffering. And we can't just say, but we're the ones benefiting from here, so we're going to come up with lots of complicated reasons or complicated explanations that make us feel okay about a process of othering. The minute we go into a process of othering, we are suffering. So at the heart of a non-duality, we must recognize all the delusion that keeps us from that non-dual truth. So I find it fascinating that I trained for years in a Zen Buddhist monastery. Countless energy was brought, countless attention for 8 years was brought to what are the egoic structures that keep us from recognizing our true nature? How often do you think there was a recognition of collective conditioning, or how as a collective we participate in the kind of othering that we were asked to recognize as individuals? Zero. But it's the same process. So as we recognize our shared being, then the rest of that's just the beginning. As many presenters have spoken about in this conference, that's just the beginning. The rest of our practice is about aligning our lives with that understanding. And if we're going to align our lives with that understanding, we have to be willing to see all the places we're blind. And we are blind, and we are blind, and we are blind. We have to see that. So we're willing to see it in our spiritual practices often, but are we willing to see it collectively? Are we willing to see, wow, I participate in a system of dominance. Is it a creation? Yes, but so is the sense of I. So if I'm going to pay all this attention to what is my Enneagram type and how are all these different forms of I veiling our shared being, what changes when we have collective commitment for us to say, and how collectively are we veiling shared being? Because this shared being is in fact shared. I'm sure it's not lost to anyone in this room. There is no individual I that awakens. If that's new to you, I'm sorry to disappoint you. So collectively, we are in this together, which is why I love that we've focused on belonging in this panel. Sarah had a beautiful insight last night. We needed to change the name to Punk and Jazz and an invitation to belonging. Because we recognized this was going to be an emergent conversation. And that's not an accident. That's not an accident. Because this is collective. This is about we. If we're here at this conference to say, yes, I want to know and live the truth of my shared being, and I want to see all the things that veil it, then we have to see how we participate in that.
Thank you, Cavalier.
Yeah, thank you.
I want to just thank you for everyone so far, and I want to have a moment and speak to the sister who from Senegal, right? I love Senegal, and that space of reconciling this oneness and this relativeness. And I think that what is difficult is that we know, I mean, again, as you were saying, if you're in this room, you have a sense of, or know, that there is this oneness that can be proven in many ways through science, through our lived experience upon occasion. We understand that there is this universal truth. Additionally, there's this relative truth. And this relative truth ain't easy, to say the least, particularly for some people more than others. And where the problem lies, what I find in these kinds of communities, which I call the spiritual progressive communities, are this tendency to answer the relative question with a universal answer. Right? And that becomes what, you know, I know we've all probably heard this phrase, spiritual bypass, because it doesn't work. It's an inappropriate answer. It's absolutely inappropriate when we do that. And so there is this relative reality of I am Conda Mason, a black woman in America who receives and lives through the causes and conditions and all that happens that is a part of being a black woman in America. And it's real. And so has my mother and my grandmother and on and on. And so it's difficult to reconcile. And I understand what you're saying. I think that at the core of people of color in this country, I'll just stick to this country, and I think that is true for any marginalized people anywhere, that is one of the core questions that we live with when we have the breadth to even come up from underneath conditions and even question and understand the universal. It's a core question. And it's really hard to find, more than intellectually. Intellectually, you can understand the answer, but the lived experience is very different, particularly when the conditions within the country have been completely systematized, institutionalized. Everywhere it's institutional. This is an institutional issue that we're talking about. And what happens is that I believe that because it is from the beginning of this country, and there's a whole history about it. You know, the woman was talking about whiteness. There's a whole history about when actually the word white was substituted for Irish and all the other ethnicities to bring together all these white-skinned ethnicities together and pretend like you have more in common than you do on a class basis. Poor whites were combining with poor black and indigenous. And instead of that combination, it was like, no, come over here and let's be white. And there's a whole history around that, and that's a history lesson in American history. But it's the case that as people of color in this country, and what has happened is that the privilege that was instituted at that time for having white skin was completely put into every single institution that exists. The ideology underneath it, and that is when people talk about white supremacy. It's an ideology. It's an ideology that is underneath, and that was built into the systems. And so when we come up against those systems, and what happens is that this conversation about race continues to stay on a personal level. Like, I'm a good white person, I'm not racist. I'm a good person of color, I'm not racist. And as long as we keep the conversation on a personal level, the institutions continue to live and do their thing and take from all of us, take from every single one of us, white, black, brown, yellow, all of us is taking from. Because we're in this constant battle and conversation on the individual plane. And honestly, all of us should be able to, I'm hoping, well, when we talk about waking up, it's really waking up to, it's so much bigger than the individual. It is an institutional, a structural issue that keeps us fighting. And really, it's the systems of oppression that we need to be working together on to bring down.
How do I get beyond the anger? Because listening to you guys talk, I mean, it's beautiful, and I feel myself being uplifted, and I feel myself just literally moving out of that. And then one word, and I'm dropped back into the darkness of the anger. It's like, oh,
Yeah.
okay. So how do I get beyond that so that I can work?
Self-compassion. Self-compassion is where I think it begins. When we really look at that being within you that is so hurt and that has suffered and has been through a lot, if you can bring the energy of who I call my dear one Kuan Yin into reality within yourself, self-compassion, beginning with self, because often we're thinking about the other. But really, I think that it begins inside with compassion for yourself, for all that you've been through, that your family has been through, the historical compassion. And then we can go into compassion for others, because we're all a part of a system that we did not build, but we are participating in. And if we can see each other with a compassion, honestly, but starting with self, put the oxygen mask on yourself first. That is where, in my opinion, we begin. And it really has a way of breaking through, and being able to see the play that's happening. And to generate compassion and love within yourself and for yourself, and then for others. We have a few minutes, and we have a couple of questions. Let's hear your question.
I just wanted to commiserate for a second. I'm also very triggered by the cheap notion of oneness that we often talk about.
Yeah.
I feel like it's very cheap. It's very it's thrown around loosey-goosey. And for me, oneness is challenging. It's difficult. It's not an easy thing to strive for. And oneness doesn't erase our differences, our individuality. In fact, it enhances them. It allows them to vibrate at their highest, most beautiful resonance. It doesn't erase the binary. It shows the binary in the greatest possible clarity. For me, when I embrace myself as a Syrian American Muslim woman with a master's in Christian ethics and a rapper and a mother and all of those individuations allow me to be part of a collective. And that is to say that when you know yourself, you get in where you fit in. And that you realize your place in the collective, and that's what connects you so deep. And the issue I think that we find is that we never create silence and space for ourselves, especially as people of color. Like, even the way that this conversation could get derailed by one comment, for me, sitting in class with the Reverend Dr. James Cone, the father of Black liberation theology, when that would come up, he would be like, not right now. We're going to do something else right now. We're going to talk about the ways in which X, Y, and Z and recenter the conversation in the ways that were possible. And I just want to say thank you so much to you guys for standing up there right now in the midst of this world that is telling us to embrace cheap oneness, and to say, thank you for embracing the complexity and how difficult that is. Thank you so, so much, because that's not often something that can be done with such grace, the way that I've seen you all do it. So much grace, so much beauty, because people are so afraid to live inside of that complexity. So afraid to dig down deep and get to know themselves. It's when you know yourself, don't know yourself, that you can say that we're all brown. That's when you don't know yourself. That's when you don't know your history. When you know your history, you can say, I am from the tribe of X, Y, and Z, from the lineage of these people who told these stories. And it's when we get cut off from our stories that we are disconnected from the complexity, and we're disconnected from our stories. So thank you for telling your stories, because that allows us to know that we need to know our stories. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So we have 5 minutes, I've been told, and I'm thinking that we're not going to take any more questions. I think that what we need to do is just wrap it up here. And unless you want to give your time to someone out in the audience.
Just want to make one additional thing about the body and the inheritances of the body. Quantum science points to the knowledge now, we know at least 5 generations of memory is encoded in our physical bodies. So we have to make oneness with that first. 62 people's story is alive in me. I am not just me, I am my parents, I am my grandparents, I am my great-grandparents. So at a psychic level, we're triggered all the time by memories that I didn't live.
That's right. That's right.
The histories that we know in the world is also in the body. When we say come down into the body, most people don't want to go there because that's where the reality of being gets fully revealed. I want to stay in thought that I am better than my inheritance. We are our bodies. We have to love it, we have to live it, and we have to transform it from my parents. As much as I love them, they're not going to live in me as they lived in their own life. The rape has to be reconciled with marriage. I'm going to make them love each other. Why? Because it's me now.
Yeah. That's right. This is where it is. Right. That's what's up. That's what's up.
I'm not going to carry a rape in my life just because it happened in history. If it's in my blood, guess what? I will breathe in it my life. I will nurture it with my will. I'm not committed to making my history live longer and better than me. No more of that. So I'm saying I'm willing to ask us to take hold of our bodies, not the world. We carry this everywhere we go, and we know it triggers us. We know when we see another person whose story gets activated, how we feel. This is why we're asking, can we welcome all the stuff that we brought with us here? We came here to love and live. Don't die with histories untransformed. It's not good. Our ancestors will send us back. Thank you for listening.
Yes, yes, yes. Are we at time? Do you have one last thing? Do we have 1 minute? There's 1 minute left. 30 seconds each.
I feel so full of possibility and richness. And when I spoke earlier to the desire to experience a collective body that is capable of truly holding the complexity of all of our histories and our pain and our desire, our passion. I feel longing in the context of this room. And the way that I am leaving this conversation is that this is the container that we are modeling right here, right now, a radical new vision of love. And not a love that seeks to deny pain, but that holds and includes all of it. This is intimacy in action.
Beautiful.
What they said.
I really want to thank you all for making the choice to come here for the many reasons that you shared with each other to come to this session. I'm grateful whoever's responsible for this session happening here at this space, at this conference. and may it continue. And may we all feel comfort in questioning oneness, to question it and not just assume that we're all on the same page with it because you're here in these seats. May it continue that people question it and question it and question it because it's questionable. Right? There's a lot going on here. There's a lot going on here. It is a complex world. Thank you so much for coming.